Hey everybody, how's it going? So it's January the 23rd, 2024, and I decided I wanted to do an episode today on mindfulness, its origins, asking the question, who invented it? And the reason why I want to do this is, so I'm a meditation teacher, and one of the things actually that kind of irks is a strong word, but is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, is when we talk about the origins of mindfulness and we talk about the origins of meditation. I think there's a bit of misinformation that's out there that is unfortunately perpetuated by some of the biggest names in sort of the what you could call the commercial mindfulness and commercial meditation industry, about who invented meditation and mindfulness. And there's a few different reasons why it is that this information is out there. But as one who also has studied comparative religion and comparative spirituality, I can tell you some of the information about the origin of meditation and mindfulness is, as it is put out in mainstream popular culture, is probably not right. And I think we need to give people their due and appropriately give credit for spiritual practices where they are due. So the common perspective is that meditation, probably not so much like meditation as a whole, but mindfulness arose in the East, beginning with the Vedic tradition, into the Hindu tradition, and into the Buddhist tradition. And I will go so far as to absolutely say that those traditions had developed their own practices of mindfulness, absolutely. But did they create mindfulness as an umbrella term and then gift it to the world in the 1960s and the 1970s? My answer and my perspective is that is not the case. And I have a few different reasons for believing that. So let's go through why it is I think that there's a bit of this misinformation out there. Some of the biggest names, and I'm not trying to be critical and I'm not trying to be mean, but some of the biggest names in the mindfulness industry, so the Jon Kabat Zinn and you get into Sharon Salzberg, etc. There's a few different pieces that come into their perception that mindfulness is an Eastern practice that has migrated west, quote unquote. So first of all, in the Vedic tradition, the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition, one of the things that's advantageous about those traditions is that they do have written records of the practice of mindfulness and meditation in a way that other places don't. So there's good reason for people to initially believe that mindfulness and meditation, even as a whole, may have originated in the East. But as we'll see, it's not necessarily the case. One of the other pieces, and I don't mean to be unkind about this, is that the big names in the mindfulness and meditation field belong to a particular generation. And there's a bit of generational bias that kind of creeps into this topic. And the generational bias I'm talking about is sort of the baby boomer generation, kind of grew up in the 60s and 70s and came into their own. And in a wholesale rejection of Western religious structures, looked east and discovered, the Vedic tradition, the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition, and the beauties of those tradition, and really worked to bring those back into Western, so-called Western culture. But part of the issue was there's two issues. One, there began claims that the Eastern practices of mindfulness and meditation didn't originate anywhere else other than the East. And also there was a wholesale rejection in the rejection of the Western religious structures. There was also, and unfortunately, a throwing out of the baby with the bathwater, because one of the things that most people don't realize even today is that, particularly in the Catholic tradition, if you want to look at Christianity, Catholicism has a deep past in in a mystic tradition that goes back almost to the foundation of the Catholic Church, the Christian Catholic Church. We're talking at least 1800 years into the past. And with that mystic tradition came practices of what are called contemplative prayer, which is effectively meditation and mindfulness in some instances, not all of them. But when you look at the definition of mindfulness, and there's a lot of definitions of mindfulness out there, sort of a moment-by-moment awareness, with people say with equanimity or non-judgment, etc. When you look at that particular kind of definition of mindfulness, you'll see that independent of the East, the Western traditions had that as well. Certainly the Catholic mystics did, as far back as 1800 years ago. And so when there was a rejection of Western religious structures in the 60s and 70s, there was throwing out of the baby the bathwater, because most people weren't aware of Christian spirituality. They were only really aware of the structures of the institutional church. So there's a generational piece. The other piece, and we're starting to reclaim this now, is there was not a lot of attention paid up until recent years of indigenous traditions, which frankly go back far, far further into the past than the Buddhist tradition, the Hindu tradition, the Vedic tradition, certainly in North America, in Africa, and in Asia. And so we are now seeing, and there's research being done on this, that indigenous traditions, let's use North America as an example, in the conduct of certain ceremonies and traditions, there is a type of mindfulness that is being practiced solemnly in those traditions. And those go back hundreds and thousands of years, probably even further back than the Vedic tradition. And so as we turn our eye to indigenous traditions and what they offer us in terms of spiritual traditions, etc., and what they're, how it all works, we see that mindfulness is actually existing in indigenous traditions as well, and has for a very long time. And so that's an important piece. Let's see. The other piece is, and again, this is not a criticism of some of the big names, but there's not a lot of comparative religion or spirituality that goes on in the mindfulness community. There's a hardened focus in looking at the East for these practices, without looking again sort of at what other traditions, indigenous traditions, Western spiritual traditions had to offer. And I think that's how we got into this state of people thinking that mindfulness originated in the East 2,500, 3,000 years ago. So to sum up, I would agree that many of the practices that are engaged in sort of the commercial mindfulness industry have originated in the East. The way that one practices a mindfulness or mindfulness meditation. However, I would make the argument, and more evidence is starting to back us up on this, that in fact, mindfulness is universal, just as meditation is. It doesn't belong to any one particular tradition. If it did, when you're practicing mindfulness, you'd be practicing Buddhism, you'd be practicing Hinduism, you'd be practicing the Vedic tradition, and you're not. And it would be unique to those cultures, those histories, psychologies, and as we find, meditation, mindfulness, they're universal principles. They're designed for all humanity. And so it would be a little bit putting the blinders on to assume that nobody else had invented or come up with a mindfulness practice. And in fact, what we are starting to see is, even in ancient Greece, 4th century BC, there are practices in ancient Greece that could very easily fall under the category of mindfulness. Indigenous traditions, ceremonies, pilgrimages, contemplative periods, those go back thousands of years. In Catholicism, Western mysticism, particularly, the Desert Fathers, etc., coming out of the 2nd and 3rd century AD, they clearly had a mindfulness type of practice in contemplative prayer. And so while there are cultural and religious religiously and traditionally unique forms of practicing mindfulness. I would agree with that. And much of what has been imported through Jon Kabat Zinn, etc., is based on those Eastern practices. Mindfulness as a whole is not an Eastern practice. It's not a Western practice. It's a human practice. And I would argue it's far older than the Vedic tradition and far more universal around the globe than is given credit for. So I think it's wrong to say mindfulness started with the Vedic tradition and the Hindu tradition and the Buddhist tradition. I think that is actually incorrect. And I think that engaging in such a perspective, however well-intentioned, actually shuts out beneficial practices that are offered in other traditions as being something other or not less than. I don't think that that's the intention, but I think something other and something that doesn't qualify as mindfulness. I think that's an incorrect perspective. But that's my take. Let's see what you say.